Hey, today we want to talk about universals, and today we're looking into more detail what that means and why that is a study within linguistics and how different linguists approach this kind of area. So let's talk about universals and what we actually mean by that. Is there something that all languages have in common? That all languages of the world, all human languages of the world have in common? If so, what is that? One question is, why is this an interesting question at all? Stop and pause here for a moment and nominate a few suggestions of why you think this is an interesting question, either for linguists or for psychologists or for evolutionary anthropologists or your auntie. Why is that potentially an interesting question, and what might it be able to tell us? Why might we be interested in this? Following from this is actually what kind of methodology is there that might allow us to answer this question? I think it's fundamentally important to distinguish between questions for which we may be able to find an answer, and this answer might be testable, falsifiable, or verifiable. And on the other hand, questions which we might have an opinion on, or we might believe certain things, but they're not testable or falsifiable or verifiable in a scientific way. Maybe, I'm not sure if that's fair to philosophy, but let's say a question that we cannot really answer, maybe it's still worth thinking about and acknowledge that we cannot answer it. I don't know, maybe more like a philosophical discussion. What we want to have here is a more scientific discussion. So that means we need a methodology that allows us to answer this question. So what kind of methodology would allow us to answer the question, what do all languages of the world share? And there are two ways of answering this question. One is theoretically, if we had the means to do whatever we wanted, even though it costs a lot of time and money, think about what kind of methodology would we want to engage in if we had all the means necessary. And then maybe a more practical approach, given that we don't have all the money in the world and do not have all the time in the world, how can we go about approximating a good answer to this question with the means that we have available? So again, you need to stop the video here, think about it, and write down some suggestions. Now, the next few slides are about how people have already approached this question. Noam Chomsky is a world-famous linguist. He is a very important figure in the field of linguistics internationally and has been for a very long time. Steven Pinker is also a very famous, important linguist, and here's a quote by Pinker about Chomsky's position, just because Pinker put it in such a nice little nutshell. I'm actually quoting Pinker here on Chomsky rather than Chomsky with his own words at this point. So Pinker says, according to Chomsky, a visiting Martian scientist would surely conclude that aside from their mutually unintelligible vocabularies, Earthlings speak a single language. Okay, so Chomsky suggests we actually all speak basically a single language. We can't communicate with each other in all the different languages of the world because there's so much different vocabulary. So he's contrasting vocabulary with the rest of language. So that suggests the vocab is different in the languages of the world, but the other stuff, and the other stuff would be grammar. Grammar is essentially the same across the languages of the world, and a visiting Martian scientist, a scientist from Mars, would look at all these languages, and kind of check this out and say, actually, it's all one language. They're just different, if you want, dialects with different vocabularies, but structurally, they're clearly a single language. Interesting. Now, based on this suggestion, what can we expect about the languages of the world? Well, we can expect that many features of the grammar of the languages of the world would be shared. and it's the vocab that is really different. Really interesting hypothesis. Back to our question, how do we test this assumption? Back to our question of methodology. This is a strong hypothesis. It's all the same structurally, underlyingly. We really have the same stuff happening. How do we test this? Or would it be okay to just assume that this is a working hypothesis? Can we just say, actually, we don't test this. We just run with this and until we stumble into counter evidence. What would you think scientifically? Is it okay to just use this as a working hypothesis? What is a good scientific approach? Chomsky has this assumption that humans are born with some kind of hardwired language capacity. And he originally called it the language acquisition device, or later it was called universal grammar. So the idea is we are born with some kind of hardware in our brains that allows us to learn the languages we are exposed to as babies. And so Chomsky, now I have a direct Chomsky quote, suggests, I have not hesitated to propose a general principle of linguistic structure on the basis of observation of a single language. The inference is legitimate on assumption that humans are not specifically adapted to learn one rather than another language. So this is really interesting. Chomsky says, I have the assumption that we as humans are born with something somewhere in our hardware that allows us to learn language, and it allows us to learn any language we're exposed to as babies, right? Doesn't matter whether I'm born in Somalia and I grow up speaking Somali, or if I'm born in Iceland and grow up speaking Icelandic, our brain acquires the language we're exposed to. So he says, the assumption is we have some kind of built-in universal grammatical knowledge, or a language acquisition device, as it was termed in his early writing. And now comes the really important methodological step. He says, because of this assumption, I can actually look at a single language and make statements about universal grammar, about all the languages of the world. So there's a really interesting methodological step. I'm making an assumption, and based on this assumption, I can hypothesize whatever. So my assumption is all languages are basically the same structurally. And based on this assumption, all I need to do to find out about universal features of language is by looking at one language. Because I believe fundamentally all languages are sharing the same structural nitty-gritty cogs and whatever. Okay? So he says, so that's the inference. I can study a single language to learn about the languages of the world. And he says the inference is legitimate on the assumption that humans are not specifically adapted to learn one specific language, but any language. So the fact that we can learn any language suggests we have some kind of inbuilt language capacity, language knowledge, something language specific. Okay, there is an assumption. On that premise, he suggests observation, a single language is all we need to do. So my question here, what kind of methodology does this suggest for researching universals? We want to find out what language is universals. Well, it's already actually stated in this quote. The methodology that this suggests, this particular approach suggests, is we do not need to look at the 6,500 and whatever languages of the world to learn about universals. We can choose one language and study that in detail. And if our hypothesis is correct, our assumption, that will tell us about the languages of the world. Now, the important thing is it's based on an assumption, a working hypothesis. And so this is totally fine methodology as long as we keep in mind it's based on an assumption and we need to be ready to challenge that assumption. So if we happen to find that if we look at one language and we assume that a certain structure is that we observe in this language is universal to all languages of the world, if we find a counterexample, we have to take stock of that and then see whether we have to revise our assumption potentially. So the whole point here is this methodology is based on an assumption which in principle is falsifiable, or we have to test, we have to remember it's a working hypothesis. How does that gel with the kind of methodologies that you came up with? When I asked what kind of methodologies can you think of to research universals in the languages of the world, is this one of the excuse me, is that one of the methodologies you have thought of, or what kind of methodologies did you come up with in this question? So then we have two other scholars, also very important and very influential in the field of linguistics. They are Nick Evans and Steve Levinson. Nick Evans is here in Australia. Steve Levinson has been working in Europe. They say Chomsky's position is that the difference between languages are somehow superficial. Remember the Martian scientists saying essentially it's all the same language, just different vocab. So they say Chomsky's position is that the difference between differences are somehow superficial. This, as at first a working hypothesis, became a dogma, and it's wrong. That is really interesting. So what they're saying is Chomsky started with a working hypothesis, with an assumption on which he built a methodology, but then in the process of his research, his work, he and his followers, and there are many, it's a very important camp in linguistics, kind of forgot that this was a working hypothesis rather than a proven fact. And they suggest, Evans and Levinson suggest, that this assumption has actually become a dogma, as in we believe in this, we do not have to prove it, we do not have to test it. And they take issue with this. Okay, that's where Evans and Levinson are coming in. This, at first a working hypothesis, became a dogma, and it's wrong. There are problems with making simple, interesting statements that are true for all languages of the world. And most straightforward claims are simply false. And we will return to this statement throughout the unit and look at suggestions of what might be a universal human language. And we will look at suggested universals and whether they hold, or in which form they can hold as a universal for human languages. Okay, now they say most straightforward claims are simply false, as in all languages have, fixed word order, or all languages have word classes. They're suggesting most straightforward statements are simply false. The fact is that it's a jungle out there. Languages differ in fundamental ways. So this is the Evans and Levinson position, which is in opposition to the Chomskyan statement that we looked at earlier. So I'm saying welcome to the jungle, which is grammar and structure in the languages of the world that we want to explore here. And it is really super fascinating what we find in terms of how languages differ and express things in different ways, and whether it's always grammar or are there other ways independent of grammar of how to express things, like, grammatical tense versus talking about time. They're not the same thing. And the question is it only skin deep, as Chomsky suggests, or is it really deep, different, fundamentally different structures in the language of the world? Super interesting stuff, and we will spend quite a bit of time on this. As a red thread throughout the unit, we're going to return to the Chomskyan position, to certain universal language structure features are innate. Essentially, it's all the same, and what is not shared across the languages of the world cannot be innate, otherwise a baby couldn't learn that particular part of grammar, because it's not, if we're not hardwired for it, we couldn't learn it. We are born with language knowledge, something like that. On the other hand, Evans and Levinson, it's a jungle of diversity and variation that we find in the languages of the world. And so, as a kind of bit of a pop approach, I'm calling them the Martian theory. Oh, gesturing the wrong way. The Martian theory. That's our Martian. The Martian theory. Basically, same structure across all languages of the world. Or the jungle theory. Here, our little monkey. So Evans and Levinson are the jungle theory. Chomsky, Pinker, and many other people are the Martian theory. So, variation in language. There's a great deal of variation in the languages of the world. The important question is the variation only on the surface, as Chomsky suggests, or is it deep and structurally very, deep and dividing, whatever? Are there limits and patterns to this variation? That's an interesting question. Do we have variations everywhere in any random ways, or is the variation also in some kind of way structured, predictable, following certain patterns or filling certain boxes or something like that? So is there madness to the how does it go? Is there structure to the madness? Anyway, you know what I mean. Can we characterize possible versus impossible variation in human language? So these are language questions that kind of follow from these big discussion points. Linguistic typology. What is that? So linguistic typology, it's the study of language types. So the idea here is that there are different type of languages that structurally differ in some way. So you can tell already by the type of questions we're interested in here. Are there types of languages? This is more in the jungle camp. There's a kind of endeavor that the jungle camp dwellers like Evans and Levinson are more interested in, because the Chomsky camp would be saying, well, basically all languages are of the same type, fundamentally, because the variation is only on the surface. So the questions around linguistic typology, what phenomena exist and what type exist, and the research quest into linguistic typology is more in the jungle camp. And the questions we're asking here, are there types of languages? One of the earliest typologists was Wilhelm von Humboldt, and he was a linguist who identified 3 morphological types. So morphology, the study of words, the study of how words are combined or how are made up. And he distinguishes the notion of isolating languages, agglutinating languages, and fusional languages. If you immediately know what that means, great. If not, stop this video. Go somewhere, and if it's Wikipedia, that's fine by me. Wikipedia is great for quick lookups and definitions and stuff like that. Have a look under isolating languages, agglutinating languages, and fusional languages now. Pause here. Okay, so earliest typologist, if you want, was Wilhelm von Humboldt. Then we have more modern traditions of linguistic typology, very much grounded in the work by Joseph Greenberg. And he worked a lot on implicational statements. So he was interested in how certain features correlate in languages. So he made implicational statements of the type, if a language has property A, then it will also, or most likely, have property B. So it was looking at, as I say, the pattern in variation. It's like, here is one feature. If languages have this, they very commonly also have this version of another feature. So connection between different linguistic phenomena. So a classic one is looking at word order. Languages with the word order where the verb precedes the object, so verb-object word order, or VO languages, they usually have prepositions. What are prepositions? They're little words like on, towards, to, at. These are prepositions. Now they're called prepositions because they precede the noun or the noun phrase that they go with, that they modify, that they govern. So on the table, at the bus stop, towards the cat, whatever. So they precede the nouns, the noun phrase. It turns out that languages with the word order object-verb are quite consistently, it's not that there aren't counterexamples, but quite consistently have postpositions. So in the language that I've studied in Papua New Guinea, Saliba, you say tebolo unai, and tebolo is table, it's a long word, and unai means in, on, at, or something like that. And it follows the noun phrase. So tebolo unai versus on the table. And Saliba, lo and behold, has object-verb word order. So English is it's behaving typically here for the VO language in that it has prepositions, and Saliba is behaving typically for OV languages in that it has postpositions. And so prepositions and postpositions are different versions of the same word class. The umbrella term for prepositions and postpositions would be adpositions, Latin at, kind of with, near, something like that. So prepositions, postpositions depends on, refers to the order of the adposition and the noun phrase. So framework-based versus framework-neutral approaches. Here is a quote by Johanna Nichols, who's also popping up in our readings. I should suggest that what we call typology is simply framework-neutral analysis and theory. So she says typology, linguistic typology, and the study of language types and features which are shared or not are a type of linguistic grammatical theory. But she says it's a framework-neutral analysis and theory. So what she means by framework-based approaches is what is also often called syntactic theories. And syntactic theories are theories of how grammar works. And one of the most important, or probably the most important proponents of syntactic theories is Chomsky. So Noam Chomsky created syntactic theories trying to describe the nature of grammar, always with this idea that the nature of grammar is shared across all languages of the world, and his syntactic theory is trying to distill what these features are that are shared across the languages of the world and in the grammar. Chomsky is not the only one. There are many different syntactic theory framework-based approaches. Another one would be Van Valen, for example, another important author. There's a whole bunch of them with different approaches. And the point she's making here, Nichols, is that framework-based approaches are a particular type of packaging or a particular type of approaching grammar that is kind of very theory-specific, where each theory has assumptions of how things work and depictions of how things belong together. So in a way, every framework-based approach has its own language in the sense of terminology, of talking about things. And the problem is that because each theory has its own terminology and language, that it can become quite impenetrable. So I have studied linguistics for quite a while, I've practiced linguistics for quite a while, but I would not be able to necessarily read an article that is written in a syntactic theory that I have not studied, because I might just not understand the terminology and the assumptions. And that's the point that Nichols is making. So syntactic theories often love trees as a formal representation of linguistic structure. Trees can be really helpful to visualize structure. And we mean trees of this type here. So the upside down tree, here's a syntactic tree of a verb phrase. Quickly give the book to Alice. Now that's one simple tree. Every grammar, every syntactic theory has its own way of depicting things. The diagrams are very different in different theories, and they are very hard to penetrate unless you actually study that theory. It gets wilder. Here is some lexical function grammar. And here is something from Roland reference grammar. That's Van Valen. he used to joke that he wished he could have a three-dimensional depiction of his syntactic trees. If you find these trees scary, the good news is we basically do not deal with them here, certainly not with the different possible permutations. We do a really bare bones approach to how can we use trees to visualize language structure, but we do not study trees or a particular theory here. So good news for you if you find this stuff scary. Now, if you love this kind of stuff and these formalisms and ways of distilling grammar into formulas and stuff like that, bad news. We are not really doing that here. So that's something that in many unis that you would do in a class where we talk about syntax and syntactic structure and syntactic theories. What we're doing in this class is more exploring the phenomena we find in the languages of the world. We're less worried about how different theories depict them or portray or analyze them. So that's less the focus of our class.